Senator Pratt.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy President. The Labor Party and Labor senators oppose these clean energy legislation carbon tax repeal bills. Why? Because Labor's position on climate change is very clear. It is a clear position based on scientific evidence and sound economic principles. We on this side of the chamber understand the need to reduce the risk of dangerous climate change by cutting dangerous greenhouse gas emissions. We on this side of the chamber understand that the best way to do this is to recognise the real cost of pollution in the bottom line of our nation's polluters. And this is best achieved through a market-based mechanism. Labor established such a mechanism. In the short time of operation, this mechanism has delivered cuts to emissions with no negative effect on inflation and continued employment and economic growth. The so-called carbon tax or fixed-priced period, in Labor's view, can be removed, leaving an already legislated emissions trading scheme which puts in place a legal cap on carbon pollution. We know that industry is quite capable of finding its best method of operating efficiently within that cap. We need the caps to comply with our international obligations to meet emissions and emissions reduction targets. And these bills before the chamber today remove Australia's ability to meet the binding international obligations and reduce the risk of dangerous climate change on our planet. Those opposite are ignoring the science. They're ignoring the future, they ignore the environment, and they will create higher costs for our economy, for it to adapt in the future and to manage greenhouse pollution in our nation. The Coalition seek to abandon the efficiency of a market-based mechanism with no effective replacement mechanism for emissions reduction. Direct action is a slogan, not a policy. Direct action nationalises the carbon pollution problem, asking taxpayers to pay rather than polluters themselves. Direct action is flawed and cannot achieve our globally binding targets. Direct action does not have legislated emissions reduction targets. If we pass these bills, there will be, in effect, no emissions reduction strategy for our nation in place. Direct action will not actually exist when its predecessor is eliminated. The other damage of these bills that we've seen in earlier debates, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation abolition and the Climate Change Authority abolition, and indeed the cuts to funding through the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. Collateral damage driven by political ideology rather than sensible climate change policy. We know the Coalition is not at all serious about addressing climate change. It is not in the Coalition's knitting. John Howard calls those of us that accept climate change calls us religious zealots. And as we all know, our Prime Minister Tony Abbott once said climate change is crap. There are many on the other side, I know, that do not accept climate change despite the scientific evidence. And these bills demonstrate that they are winning the day within these debates within the Coalition. There is, however, a plethora of scientific and economic experts that back Australia's existing climate change strategy. And what I have found extraordinary during the hearings that we've held on the direct action policy is that we cannot find, the Coalition has been unable to put forward a single advocate for their discredited policy, a single advocate that is prepared to front up to the Senate committees and defend this policy as a good idea. Where are the recognised experts that say direct action is a good strategy? Where are the credible experts that say direct action can work? Nowhere, because there are none. We don't hear cries back to an expensive scheme to pay companies to pollute. Why would anyone support such a proposition? But we do hear countries will achieve high levels of emission reduction at much lower cost because of the use of a market-based mechanism. While this government dismantles our functioning emissions reduction program and sits on its hands over climate change, the CO2 in our atmosphere is at a record high and Australia is on track for our warmest year ever. I've been dismayed this week to see the Bureau of Meteorology warning West Australians that they face decades of rising temperatures with hotter, drier and more extreme summers. This summer in WA was the driest in 5 years for Perth, with just 2 millimetres of rain, and the driest on record ever for Mandurah. We had only 3 days where rain fell, and not one drop fell last month, the first dry since February 2000. And our Weather Bureau, as we all know, is normally conservative, but climate expert Neil Bennett said this week the data was staring climate change sceptics in the face. It's climate change, he says. It's warming, it's staring you in the face. As we said in the report of the Senate Environment and Communications Committee inquiry, removing this policy suite for the sake of a slight reduction in utilities costs in one financial year is reckless and irresponsible. It is reckless and irresponsible to allow Australia to fall behind in our contribution to the global emissions reduction effort. It is reckless and irresponsible to expose us to future costs and potential international retribution for our contribution to global warming on this planet. Late last year, in its Climate and Carbon Aligning Prices and Policies report, we know that the OECD highlighted the need for countries to price carbon. What they said was, if governments are serious in their fight against climate change, the core message of this reform must be that the cost of CO2 emissions will gradually increase, creating a strong economic incentive to reduce carbon and to shift towards a zero-carbon trajectory. A central feature of such an approach is placing a price on carbon. On a per capita basis, Australia punches above its weight in its contribution to global CO2 emissions. This is a well-known fact, and it places a high moral obligation on us as a nation to keep pace with the world's efforts to tackle climate change. Otherwise, as a country, we are effectively a significant drag on the efforts of other nations. Why would they act when, as a country with a high standard of living, we are emitting above the average per capita? Way, way above the average per capita. It is a profound moral obligation on our country to act. So, you know, we had a credible policy that put us, that encouraged global action, and that is what these bills are repealing. So far from being at the leading edge of this effort, we will fall behind. We will fall behind the rest of the world. And Australia becomes, and we are effectively already because of these bills before us, the pariah in the international community because of the negative political will of a government that is putting the future of our planet last in its priorities. Expert submissions to the Senate Environment and Communications Committee inquiry, they supported a carbon price as the most effective emissions mitigation strategy. One of those credible experts who I've had the pleasure of seeing give evidence is Dr. Frank Jotso. He says The carbon pricing mechanism currently in place is an economically sound basis for climate change mitigation policy in Australia. Repealing Australia's clean energy legislation and related bills is undesirable if a lasting policy framework for greenhouse gas emissions reductions is to be established, and if emissions reductions are to be achieved in a cost-effective manner. If emissions reductions are to be achieved without carbon pricing, then regulatory and subsidy approaches will need to play a larger role. These are, he says, generally more costly and less effective in creating incentives for long-term investment in low-carbon options by Australian businesses. Repeal will exacerbate policy uncertainty with adverse effects on investments. And that is exactly the path that the government is taking us down. Mr Nathan Fabian, CEO of the Investor Group on Climate Change, he says, a scheme cap that reflects an emissions reduction objective, broad coverage of sources of emissions in the economy, transitional assistance arrangements for trade-exposed sectors, the ability to access international permits to achieve least cost abatement, and the capacity to respond to deeper reduction targets as necessary over time are the essential elements of good climate change policy. The Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, well, they noted that the Productivity Commission considers an emissions trading scheme is by far the most cost-effective way for Australia to contribute to global efforts to mitigate climate change. So what we have here is a coalition government, repeal bills and direct action policy creating a significant level of uncertainty in industry. Even worse, what we have here are these bills creating a dearth in climate change mitigation, and no one knows really what the coalition will put in its place. What we do know, and we know this from the evidence that our committees have received, we know this from the intellectual or lack of intellectual basis on which direct action is placed, that the coalition's heart is not in placing any decent strategy to tackle climate change. It has no emphasis on a decent policy strategy. Worse still, the repeal of these bills means we no longer have the economic tools we need for the future. This isn't just about tackling climate change. This is about actually providing the capacity for our economy to transition to the economic future that we inevitably know is coming, one in which carbon is constrained. So for Labor, tackling climate change is something we take very seriously, not just from an environmental point of view, but very importantly from an economic point of view. A long-term framework means we have the stability, the certainty for investors, for industry and the wider community. Direct action, it is patently obvious, cannot deliver a long-term commitment. It is bound by the term of the forward estimates. And, personally, I think direct action is the policy that the coalition has put forward so that they can be seen to be doing something on climate change, when they don't actually mean it. Why? Because it cannot set a cap. It cannot have a legislated binding target. It cannot be effective policy. It creates uncertainty, it restricts innovation and investment in clean energy in our country. It is completely counter to any rational thinking. The coalition is stuck in short-term political thinking, more interested in political slogans about the carbon tax. The coalition government is here for today without regard for future generations. They're here exploiting the situation for maximum political profit, and they are leaving a policy wasteland in its path. And I'm pleased to say we don't think like that on this side of the chamber. We are about the future. We are about opening the door for our society to develop and thrive into this century and the next. We know that the short-term thinking the Coalition is putting forward will make our local industry less competitive, not more competitive. The Prime Minister's claim of a reduction of an average $550 a year on households is completely flawed. He said household electricity costs will be $200 less and gas $70 less. But there is no evidence that substantiates this. The Grattan Institute, ACOS and other significant stakeholders that I don't have time to quote directly have all refuted these claims. Labor's clean energy package included the Jobs and Competitiveness program, which smoothed the transition for emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries. Now, these industries have no clear path forward under the Coalition's policy. No clear path forward under the Coalition's direct action policy. So we are locking in uncertainty and, these industries will need to change for the future at some point, but you are removing the tools and the capacity for them to do that. So what we have in our existing policy with legally binding caps gives certainty and the capacity to meet future targets and to allow industry to transition. It gives flexibility for companies to choose how best to meet their emissions obligations within the targets set. Our existing policy is achieving carbon mitigation outcomes, and we have a government that is trying to throw that all away. Future generations will ask, why? Why did they throw it all away? History will show we have a Prime Minister that is stuck in the past who chose to abandon rational, functioning policy for short-term political gain. As we heard in the hearings for direct action is a policy not based on any scientific evidence and not based on a credible economic framework. So to conclude my remarks on these bills, the reality is that the world, with or without us, will be moving to an energy revolution. A revolution in the way we generate and use energy for domestic, commercial, industrial and transport purposes. If you accept, and I certainly do, that climate change is real and caused by carbon emissions, then we have to recognise that having the tools to reduce the carbon in our atmosphere is a basic economic necessity. Failing to provide those tools, as the Coalition is doing, will leave our households and businesses without the capacity to adapt, and the rest of the world will benefit from changes, and Australians will be left in the dead-end jobs of yesterday, while other countries are getting a competitive advantage way ahead of us. This is the path that the Coalition is leaving us down. We do not want to see our great technologies go offshore without the investment being made in Australia in that technology existing here in our own country. We cannot afford to miss the boat on this. It is our opportunity to be at the leading edge of the industries of the future. We cannot afford to be left behind on that front. So Labor's Clean Energy Package gives Australia that framework to keep up with the rest of the world, the framework that those opposite are repealing. The Coalition want to destroy that framework and, along with it, the associated investment for businesses and jobs. We oppose the bill for the sake of our environment and the sake of the jobs of the future.
Senator Mills.